April 10, 1945. Across the ruins of a German airfield, a cold wind moved through silence and smoke. The war was nearing its end, though no one had dared say it aloud. Along the broken runway stood a line of German officers, men once feared, now reduced to still figures among debris. Their gray uniforms were stained with dust, medals dulled by exhaustion. For years, these generals had commanded armies across continents. Now they waited for capture. A U.S. Army sergeant walked down the line, clipboard in hand, counting prisoners. Behind him, a Jeep engine idled, its radio quietly playing a Glenn Miller tune. The cheerful melody echoed off the ruins, an oddly peaceful sound against the backdrop of defeat. The German officers watched the approaching Americans with uneasy silence. Rumors had already spread among them, whispers of executions, of trials, of humiliation. Some tried to maintain the composure of command, others simply stared at the ground. When the trucks arrived, the men boarded without resistance. Dust rose behind the convoy as it moved toward the coast, carrying what was left of a shattered command structure. Among them sat a tall general with a silver mustache, a man who had once led armored divisions through Poland, France, and Russia. Now he stared at his gloved hands as if they belonged to someone else. The young Americans escorting them were barely out of their teens. Their uniforms were loose, their confidence quiet but unmistakable. One soldier offered a cigarette to the general beside him. The officer hesitated, unsure if it was mockery. The American smiled and said, "It's lucky strike, sir." The gesture was small, but it broke through the silence. After 2 days, the convoy reached the port of Le Havre. Hundreds of German prisoners stood behind barbed wire as Liberty ships waited in the harbor, gray silhouettes rocking gently with the tide. The prisoners were told they would be questioned in America. No one understood why interrogation required an ocean. That night, a thin rain fell. A young U.S. Army translator, himself a Jewish refugee from Berlin, moved among the prisoners, checking names. Some Germans looked away. Others held his gaze a moment too long, realizing who he was. Later, the translator wrote in his diary, "They expected ropes. We gave them paperwork. When dawn broke, the prisoners were led aboard the ships. Below deck they found rows of bunks and the smell of oil and seawater. An American sailor watching them said quietly, 'They look more like professors than soldiers.'" As the ship pulled away from the French coast, a few Germans began softly singing Lily Marlene. The song, once an anthem for soldiers on both sides, drifted through the steel corridors. An American guard, listening from the doorway, joined in, his broken German matching their melody. For the first time since their surrender, one of the captured officers smiled, not in pride, but in disbelief. The journey across the Atlantic had begun, not just from Europe to America, but from power to powerlessness, from arrogance to understanding. None of them yet knew it, but this voyage would become the first chapter of a new kind of education, one taught not by weapons, but by mercy. When the Liberty ship finally reached the American coast, it was just after dawn. The mist hung low over the Atlantic waters, softening the horizon where the ocean met the land. For the German prisoners aboard, this was their first glimpse of the United States, a country most had only heard of in propaganda broadcasts or seen on faded postcards confiscated from Allied soldiers. As they stepped off the gangway, the salty wind carried with it the smell of pine and distant fields. Some of the younger officers looked around with quiet wonder, realizing that despite being prisoners, they had arrived in a place untouched by the ruin that had consumed Europe. Their destination was Camp Shelby, Mississippi, a vast military installation surrounded by dense woods and humid air. The convoy of trucks carrying the prisoners drove through small American towns, places with gas stations, children playing by the roadside, and people who paused to watch as the convoy rolled past. There was no shouting, no hatred in their faces. Just curiosity. Inside the trucks, the prisoners said little. They were exhausted from the long voyage. Some stared out the windows, seeing in every tree and building a reminder of what their homeland had lost. At the camp gates, a sign read simply, Prisoner of war camp. U.S. Army property. The gates opened, and the new arrivals entered a world far different from what they had expected. Instead of barbed wire and brutality, they found neat rows of wooden barracks, a mess hall, even a small library. American guards stood watch, but their manner was disciplined rather than cruel. The commandant, Colonel David Henderson, greeted the captured officers with calm authority. "You are soldiers," he told them. "The war is over for you. How you live here will depend on your conduct. You will be treated with the respect due to prisoners of war, as long as you act accordingly." His tone was even, without malice. For many of the German officers, it was the first time in years they had heard authority without fear behind it. Days turned into weeks. The camp settled into a rhythm. Morning roll call, breakfast, assigned duties. Some prisoners were sent to work in nearby farms, others maintained the campgrounds. A few began to learn English. The Americans were surprised at their discipline and courtesy. The Germans were equally surprised at the absence of hatred. At night, behind the wooden walls of their barracks, the conversations turned inward. They spoke of home, of cities bombed into rubble, of families lost, of the Führer who had promised victory and delivered ashes. One of the prisoners, a former colonel from Munich, kept a small journal. In it, he wrote, "Here, among our enemies, we are learning what we had forgotten: decency. They guard us with rifles, but it feels less like captivity and more like reflection." The Americans had another purpose for this camp beyond containment. Quietly, they were studying the psychology of the German officer class. How had such an educated nation followed a dictator so blindly? What had made men of science and culture surrender to fanaticism? To find the answers, a group of U.S. intelligence officers began interviewing the prisoners, not with threats, but with patience. Among them was Captain Samuel Levine, a soft-spoken academic from New York who had once taught philosophy. He spoke fluent German and approached his subjects as if in a seminar, not an interrogation. In one of his reports, Levine wrote, "They are not monsters, most of them. They are men who stopped asking questions when obedience became easier than thought." As weeks passed, the barriers between captor and captive began to blur. Some of the prisoners helped teach German to American soldiers preparing for post-war assignments in Europe. Others played chess, shared music, and debated politics. Still, not all accepted their fate. A few remained loyal to the lost cause, bitter, unrepentant, convinced that Germany's defeat was temporary. But even they could not ignore the small, daily contradictions around them. Guards who treated them fairly, officers who offered them respect, a system that punished cruelty rather than rewarded it. One evening, as the sun set over the pine trees, the camp loudspeaker played a jazz record, Benny Goodman's "Sing." "Sing, sing!" The rhythm echoed across the yard, and for a brief moment, laughter broke out among the prisoners. The guards smiled too. It was the sound of life returning, a sound neither side had heard in years. In that strange stillness of post-war captivity, something unexpected began to happen. The defeated were learning from the victors not through lectures, but through example. The war had been fought with guns and bombs, but the rebuilding of minds had begun quietly, over shared cigarettes, chess games, and music drifting through a Mississippi night. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but in the minds of the victors, a new struggle was already beginning. Across America, the air was filled with optimism, industry, and relief. Yet behind the guarded walls of certain military camps, the tone was quieter, more cautious. The question was no longer how to defeat Germany, but how to understand it. At Camp Shelby, and in dozens of similar facilities across the United States, teams of military intelligence officers worked methodically through stacks of files. Each page carried a name, a rank, and a history of a man who had served the Nazi regime. Some were ordinary soldiers. Others had built weapons, led scientific divisions, or directed programs that had changed the course of the war. Among them was Major Hans Keller, an aeronautical engineer from Stuttgart. Before the war, he had worked on experimental jet propulsion, a field the Allies were only beginning to explore, Keller was intelligent, composed, and careful with his words. He denied involvement with the Nazi Party, but could not deny that his work had fueled the Luftwaffe's war machine. He was one of hundreds identified as valuable assets. The Americans called the project Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was a scientific intelligence program meant to gather information. Unofficially, it was a race against the Soviets, who were conducting similar hunts in the ruins of Berlin. Captain Samuel Levine, the quiet intelligence officer who had spent weeks interviewing German prisoners, now found himself in the middle of something larger than he had imagined. His job was no longer to judge the past, but to select who might be useful for the future. In one of his field notes, he wrote, "We are not choosing between innocence and guilt anymore. We are choosing between knowledge and ignorance." At Camp Shelby, selected prisoners were quietly moved to separate quarters. Their treatment improved. They were given access to technical documents, drawing paper, even laboratory equipment. In return, they were asked to share everything they knew about engines, missiles, chemical research, radar, and flight. For many of the Germans, this cooperation was both a relief and a moral burden. Some saw it as a second chance, others as betrayal. But all of them understood one truth: the world they had known was gone, and survival now depended on what they could offer. When interrogations began, they did not look like the scenes of war films. There were no dark rooms, no shouted questions. Instead, American officers spoke in calm tones, often over coffee. They appealed to reason, to intellect, even to pride. Germany led the world in science once, one officer told Keller. "Do you want the Russians to take that legacy, or do you want to rebuild it here?" Keller hesitated. He thought of his colleagues who had vanished into Soviet custody. He thought of his wife, still in the ruins of Munich, waiting for news. And so he nodded. Slowly, reluctantly, he agreed to cooperate. Weeks turned into months. Reports flowed from the camps to Washington. Designs for aircraft, chemical analyses, missile blueprints. The more the Americans learned, the clearer it became. These prisoners held the keys to technologies that could shape the future. By late 1946, the first groups of German scientists were secretly transferred to military bases in Texas, Ohio, and Alabama. Their official records were rewritten, Nazi affiliations erased, resumes sanitized. The goal was simple: keep their knowledge out of Soviet hands. Not everyone agreed with this approach. Some American officers called it hypocrisy. Others called it necessity. Captain Levine, the same man who had believed in the power of decency, began to question his own role. One evening, as he reviewed the files of men now working freely under U.S. protection, he wrote in his private journal, "We are winning the peace the same way we fought the war, by choosing the lesser evil. But perhaps that is what peace always is." The moral lines of victory were beginning to blur. For the first time, the victors and the defeated were building something together, not for the past, but for a future neither fully trusted. Outside, the war had ended. Inside these secret rooms, it had only changed form. The year was 1947. In Germany, cities still lay in ruins. Walls cracked open, streets filled with the echoes of a lost empire. But across the Atlantic, in the quiet fields of Huntsville, Alabama, something extraordinary was beginning. Beneath the American flag, men who had once served the Third Reich now walked freely through military laboratories. They wore civilian clothes, carried notebooks, and spoke in careful English. Their names were recorded under new identities. Their pasts quietly erased. They were no longer prisoners, they were consultants. Among them was Dr. Hans Keller, the same aeronautical engineer once questioned at Camp Shelby. His new home was Redstone Arsenal, a sprawling base where the U.S. Army was experimenting with rocketry and missile design. It was a strange irony. A man who had built weapons for Hitler was now working for the U.S. Army, designing rockets that would one day reach the edge of space. For Keller and his colleagues, the transition was surreal. Gone were the uniforms, the salutes, the ideology. What remained was the science, pure, relentless, and consuming. They spent long days in workshops filled with the sound of engines and the smell of fuel. The Americans watched them closely, both impressed and wary. At night, the German scientists met quietly in local diners, sketching formulas on napkins and talking about propulsion systems. Some of them were genuinely grateful for the second chance. Others simply worked to survive. But for all, there was an unspoken understanding. Their future now depended on how well they could serve their new masters. Back in Washington, the moral debate continued. Could a democracy truly build its future on the knowledge of men who had served tyranny? In the press, there were whispers, rumors of former Nazis being given new lives in America. The official response was silence. The truth of Operation Paperclip remained hidden behind layers of classification. Inside the Pentagon, one senior officer defended the decision bluntly. If we don't use them, the Russians will, and history will not remember who was right, only who won. And so, the work continued. The U.S. Army's rocket program grew rapidly, powered by the minds that had once driven Germany's most advanced research. Experimental missiles like the Redstone and Hermes began to rise from the Alabama plains, symbols of a new kind of power, one measured not by armies but by altitude. For Keller, each launch brought a strange mix of pride and guilt. He often stood at the edge of the test fields, watching the trails of fire rise into the sky. The roar of the engines echoed the same sound he had once heard in wartime Europe. But this time it was not destruction that followed. It was discovery. Yet, even in this new beginning, shadows lingered. Some of the men had been closer to the machinery of evil than they admitted. Files in Berlin still held records of slave labor, of underground factories, of silent victims. Those records were quietly sealed. In America, no one asked too many questions. In 1950, as the Cold War intensified, the U.S. government made its choice official. The German scientists of Operation Paperclip would be granted citizenship. Their knowledge was now American. Their history was not. By the mid-1950s, the world had entered a new era. In laboratories and air bases across the United States, teams of engineers worked under a new dream, not of conquest, but of space. Rockets once meant for war, now aimed for the heavens. Dr. Keller, now older and grayer, kept a small photograph in his office, his wife and daughter smiling in post-war Munich. He rarely spoke of the past. When a young American engineer once asked him how it felt to have built weapons for both sides, Keller paused for a long moment and said quietly, "The sky has no borders. Only men draw them." It was a line that stayed with those who heard it. By the time the first U.S. satellites began to orbit the Earth, few remembered the German names behind them. The past had been rewritten, not erased, but folded carefully into the narrative of progress. From the ashes of defeat, a new frontier had risen, and as rockets climbed toward the stars, the question remained: had humanity learned from the war, or merely changed the battlefield? By the mid-1950s, the world had divided itself into two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, but their echo had become something new, a race for knowledge, for dominance, for the skies above. In this new conflict, missiles replaced tanks. Equations replaced battle plans. And the men who had once fought for Hitler's vision were now helping America defend its own. Inside the research centers of Huntsville, Alabama, White Sands, New Mexico, and Cape Canaveral, Florida, the atmosphere was tense but electric. Every experiment, every rocket test, every engine ignition carried not only scientific ambition, but national pride. Dr. Hans Keller and his colleagues worked tirelessly, often 16 hours a day. Their American supervisors rarely mentioned the past. They only wanted results: faster rockets, higher altitudes, longer range. What had once been a prisoner's duty had now become a competition. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union was doing the same. Their own captured German scientists, taken from the ruins of Peenemünde, were building missiles in secret under the watchful eye of the KGB. The Cold War had become a mirror, each side racing the other, each drawing its power from the same origin. In Washington, some officials began to question how far America was willing to go to stay ahead. The files of Operation Paperclip, once hidden, started to surface within government circles. Inside those folders were uncomfortable truths, names tied to forced labor, wartime experiments and factories built on suffering. But the policy was clear. Progress first, questions later. A senator from California famously said, "History is written by the victors. Science is written by whoever gets there first." And so, the work continued. In 1957, the Soviets shocked the world. Sputnik 1 Hwast, a silver sphere no bigger than a beach ball, streaked across the night sky, the first artificial satellite in human history. For a brief moment, the world looked upward in awe. For the United States, it was humiliation. The response was immediate. President Eisenhower ordered a new space agency to be formed, one that would unify military research and civilian science under a single banner. Its name would soon be known around the world: NASA. Among the scientists recruited to this mission were many of the same German engineers once brought to America under Operation Paperclip. They became the backbone of NASA's rocket division, men like Keller, whose blueprints now guided the designs for what would become the Saturn program. For the first time since the war, these former enemies stood on the threshold of something truly human: exploration. No longer building weapons, they were building hope. But the moral unease never disappeared. Some Americans who worked alongside them felt conflicted. One young engineer later recalled they were brilliant, polite, and disciplined. But when you looked into their eyes, sometimes you could see a shadow, like they carried a world they could never return to. For the Germans themselves, life in America was a quiet contradiction. They lived in suburban neighborhoods, attended church, sent their children to American schools. Yet inside, many struggled with guilt. Some wrote in private journals. Others simply worked harder, as if achievement could erase memory. In 1961, as the Cold War deepened, a wall rose in Berlin, a physical scar dividing the same nation that had once united under one flag. For Keller, it was a symbol of everything the 20th century had become: divided, fearful, but still reaching upward. That same year, the first human entered space. The Soviets had won the first round again, Yuri Gagarin's voice echoing across the radio waves. "I see Earth. It is so beautiful." The Americans redoubled their efforts. President Kennedy declared before Congress that the United States would land a man on the moon before the decade's end. It was more than a promise. It was a challenge, both to the nation and to the men who had once been enemies. Dr. Keller, now in his 50s, worked quietly on the designs that would carry that dream. To the younger engineers, he was a mentor, reserved, precise, and endlessly patient. Few of them knew his full past. Fewer asked. Sometimes, in the stillness of the laboratory after midnight, he would pause beside a rocket prototype, tracing its metal surface with his hand. He once told a colleague, "It's strange, isn't it? We built machines to destroy, and now they take us to the stars." Perhaps this is how history redeems us, not by forgetting, but by transforming purpose. The Cold War continued, but beneath its tension, a quiet evolution was taking place. The tools of war were being repurposed into the instruments of wonder. From Berlin to Washington, from the ruins of one empire to the dawn of another, humanity was learning, painfully, slowly, that progress always comes with a price. The summer of 1969. The world held its breath. On television screens from New York to Berlin, millions watched a single grainy image, a human foot descending onto the pale dust of the moon. "That's one small step for man," came the voice through static, one giant leap for mankind. The dream had become reality. And deep in the control rooms of NASA, among the quiet applause and tears of exhaustion, stood the men who had made it possible: engineers, mathematicians, pilots, and scientists. Among them was Dr. Hans Keller, now gray-haired, thin, his posture slightly stooped from decades of work. As the room erupted in cheers, he simply smiled, his eyes glistening. For him, it was not only a victory of technology, it was a redemption of purpose. A lifetime ago, his work had helped guide bombs across Europe. Now it had guided humanity to another world. When reporters later asked him how it felt to see the moon landing, Keller answered softly, "It feels like we finally used our knowledge for something beautiful." But beneath the triumph, the shadows of the past never fully disappeared. As the 1970s began, journalists and historians started uncovering the classified records of Operation Paperclip. Documents revealed names and backgrounds that had been hidden for decades. Men who had been members of the Nazi Party, some involved in forced labor programs. The story was no longer just about rockets and science. It was about morality and the uneasy choices made in the name of progress. Public opinion turned sharply. Newspapers ran headlines like "The Scientists We Forgave" and "America's Hidden Bargain." For many, the revelation was shocking. For others, it was simply confirmation of what they had always suspected, that victory had its compromises. Dr. Keller rarely spoke publicly after that. He continued to work quietly as a consultant for aerospace projects, but he avoided interviews. In one of his last recorded conversations, a journalist asked him whether he felt regret. He paused for a long time, then said, "Regret is for things you can change. What I feel is remembrance. The past doesn't vanish. It lives inside the things we build." He died in 1982, in a small house outside Huntsville. On his desk was a photograph of the moon, framed beside a faded picture of his family in Munich. Years later, a young historian visiting NASA archives came across Keller's old notebooks, pages filled with formulas, sketches, and fragments of thoughts. At the bottom of one page, in neat handwriting, he had written a single line in German: "Aus den Trümmern. Wir bauen den Himmel." From the ruins, we build the sky. It was both confession and legacy. Today, few remember the names of the men who stood behind the screens during Apollo 11. Their accents have faded, their stories folded into the larger history of human progress. Yet, the paradox remains. The same minds that once built the engines of war also built the path to the stars. As the decades pass, the moral questions linger. Can greatness be born from guilt? Can discovery truly erase destruction? Perhaps the answer lies not in history books, but in the silence of space itself. Because when humanity looked up at the moon that July night, it wasn't thinking of borders, ideologies, or flags. It was thinking of possibility, and maybe that is how history heals. Not by forgetting what we were, but by proving what we can still become.